Araminta Vale flung herself to the trench lip as the cannon roared. The smoke came first in a grey tongue licking across the earth, washing the ground with ash and iron smell. Heat rose from the trench, dry and metallic against her palms pressed to the damp earth. Her ribs trembled with the percussion of distant drums and closer detonations. The air tasted of powder, copper, and the sour bite of fear she kept from her voice. She wore the uniform of a man's regiment, blue wool now stained with mud and rain, and her hands, roughened by months of marching and fire, found the curve of her belly beneath the fabric, as if it spoke in a language of its own. 7 months, she thought. 7 months of a secret kept as carefully as a loaded musket under a blanket of stars. "Stay low. Vale!" A voice rasped near her shoulder. The timbre rough with smoke and discipline, she answered without turning. Eyes on the line where earth rose in rough, stubborn teeth against the sky. "I'm here," she said, soft as the whisper of a shell planing through air. The man who spoke, the company's second-in-command, Captain Elias Beck, gave a curt nod. A signal that said more than words. Keep your head, keep your secrets. Keep your nerve. The day's fight wore on with a terrible, stubborn insistence. The river of men moved in clumps and shivers, the ground snapping with each volley, the air pulsing with the sizzle of rifle fire and the ragged breath of soldiers who forgot to blink through the smoke. Araminta did not flinch when a shell ripped the air a dozen yards to her left, so close the earth seemed to tilt, sending a shudder through her bones that rattled every ring in her spine. The others shouted. She only counted, listening for the whispers of fear that might reveal the thing she guarded. For 7 months, she had carried another life within her, a life that grew larger with each passing dawn and hid in the shelter of fabric and fear. The regiment had learned to believe there could be nothing more fragile than a soldier's own truth, and so they fed lies to the world and swallowed them themselves. A stomach cramp, a touch of the flu, a fever, each rumor was a shield, a firebreak, a reason to keep moving and not stop to listen for what might betray them all. "Vale," came a voice above the roar. The young sergeant who had joined the unit a season ago, a boy with sunburned cheeks and the stubbornness of a mule. "You look pale as a sheet. Do I look fine?" She shot back, a half-smile breaking through the strain on her mouth. "I look like a soldier. That's enough for today." His eyes flickered, then softened with something almost tender, something that belonged to a friendship forged in war rather than in the quiet of a safe room. "If you need to sit, you tell me. Not the captain." He turned away, but not before she caught the concern in his voice, the way he kept a shield between her and a world that might demand an explanation of the secret she bore. The troop moved through the afternoon with relentless rhythm, the rattle of harness, the creak of leather, the soft thud of boots sinking into mud. The sun fell, a pale coin slipping between fingers, and the trench's sides grew slick with damp and fear. It was in those hours, the hours between bursts of noise and the quiet that followed, that Araminta felt the weight not just of the world's war, but of the life she carried. It was a life that would be judged by men who would never know the truth of it, a life she sheltered with hands that trembled now and then, not with illness but with a whisper of something new, something that would not be denied. "Vale," a voice breathed at her ear, and she started, like waking from a dream into a light that burned the eyes. It belonged to Captain Beck, tall as a tree, his uniform neat despite the grime that clung to every thread. He lowered his voice to a level that would not carry past the trench's lip. "The men say you're not well. Not well at all." She met his eyes with a steady gaze that surprised even herself. "The field is a bad nurse," she said simply. "It does not forgive. It does not forget." "Not much does in this war," he replied, a small, almost reluctant smile flitting across his lips. "But you endure." He looked toward the line where faint dust rose from boots that pressed into the clay, and his jaw tightened. 7 months, Vale. The medical staff, the quartermaster, everyone pretends not to notice. We lie for you." Her breath snagged, a sharp sound that echoed in her own ears more than in the trench's air. "We lie to save the mission," she whispered, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. "We lie to save someone's life." She paused, then continued, softer. "If I speak of it, it changes everything." The captain's eyes softened further, and for an instant the battlefield around them fell away, leaving only the two of them against time. "Nothing changes what you've done for this regiment. Nothing changes the fact you're here with us, when so many would have left for mercy or fear. He straightened as if to return to the world that demanded obedience. "But you must know we'll—" "Sir," a voice interrupted, sharp and urgent. "Incoming. Left flank. Bring down the right cover. We're going to lose ground if we don't." The sergeant's command cut through the moment, a sharp blade of sound that drove them both back into the present. The hours slid on as raw weather wears on the bones. Cold wind, then heat, then mud, then cold again. Araminta moved with the regiment, as if she wore the world upon her shoulders, her body a stubborn drumbeat that kept time with the march. The 7 months stretched out behind her like a long road, and ahead lay a birth that would force a reckoning no regiment could easily carry. As dusk laid a pale lacquer over everything, the earth, the water in the trench, the men's faces pinned like maps, she felt a new pressure, a deeper ache that radiated outward in concentric circles. She pressed her gloved hand to the fabric over her abdomen, gliding the material as if to hush a storm. The touch was both tender and terrifying. A life lay there, and it stirred in response to every blast of earth, every scream of metal, every breath of the cold air that skinned the lungs. "Vale," murmured the nurse, the regimental medic, who had joined as a temporary support when the line grew thin. She was older, wiry, with eyes that had learned to read the body's language in places no map would chart. She crouched beside Araminta, her hands steady as if she was threading a needle through a storm. "We need to keep the risk low." "You understand?" Araminta nodded, mouth dry. "And the lie?" she asked, voice a thread tugged tight. "We keep it," the nurse replied, not unkindly, but with a hardness born of years in the field. "We keep the lie to shield you and the child. We lie for you, Vale." The word lie hung in the air between them like a loose wire. Araminta's eyes flickered to the trench wall, where the mud clung in rough layers, smelling of rain that had fallen and not yet been absorbed, a scent that carried the iron sting of blood seldom spoken of aloud. She pushed a strand of hair from her face with fingers stained by the day's labor. Heart beating a heavy drum, left, right, right. Like a stubborn echo she could not silence. The days blurred into a rhythm she learned to anticipate. A burst of noise, a lull, a whisper of commands, a shared look that said more than words could. In those quiet moments, she spoke to the child she carried as if it could hear and answer. The trench, the regiment, the war itself, all of it pressed in on her with the insistence of a winter storm, beating at the walls she had built around her truth. "Do you hear it?" she asked one evening, her voice a hushed tremor as she leaned against the damp earth, listening to the distant murmur of the other side's gun lines, and the nearer, slower heartbeat of a life that had found a sanctuary inside her. A younger private, who had joined the unit not long ago, and who wore a naive bravery like a badge, replied with wide eyes that did not yet know how to hide. "I hear the river," he said, his mouth catching on the consonants as if trying to name something he could not see. "And I hear you." "I hear you breathe beside me, Vale." She offered a half smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Boys and their rivers," she teased lightly, though the color had left her cheeks, leaving the pale tint of illness or fear on her skin. "If the river is the only thing we can trust, then we're already lost." The private looked away, cheeks reddening with the sting of shame or guilt, perhaps both. She felt a moment of kinship with him, a tether across the battlefield's detours. We share the same air, the same danger, the same need to survive without losing ourselves. The 7 months stretched on, an unspoken treaty of silence that bound the regiment tighter than any oath spoken aloud, a vow to protect the one soldier who bore a life within the seams of her own body. They rehearsed stories for the camp, stories about fever and fatigue and the necessity of rest, stories that bent truth but never crossed the line that would reveal what flew beneath the surface of the uniform. Then came a day when the world around them tilted in a way that could not be ignored. The shelling grew closer, the rumble beneath the feet louder, the air thick with the copper smell of spilled soil and rain. The trench's wooden planks groaned, as if they might collapse under the weight of the moment. Araminta's breath hitched, and she pressed both hands to her abdomen, a mother instinctively protecting a child who had learned to listen to war's brutal songs long before birth. "Vale," the nurse said again, urgently, her voice threaded with fear and the kind of authority that comes only from having watched men die and rise again, with nothing left but saint. "Stubborn will. This is it. You must listen to your body now. It's time. A handful of seconds could decide a lifetime in a world where the warp of history had already chosen what would be carved into the rock of memory. The soldiers around her stilled, faces pale, eyes trained on a single point at the trench's far lip, where the enemy's line rumbled with a new confidence. The world narrowed. Noise sharpened into a single blazing line of sound. Araminta's voice broke into a whisper, a thread drawn from somewhere deep inside. "Help me, please," she murmured to the nurse, not to the men who would never understand, but to the one life that pitched and strained within her. The nurse laid a weathered hand on her shoulder. "That's a voice I'll remember for the rest of my days," she said, her own voice thick with moisture and fatigue. "I'm here, Vale. I'm not letting you go through this alone." The soldier's words took on a timbre of prayer, a litany of small promises. "It hurts," Araminta whispered, the syllables raw with truth. "It hurts in a way I never imagined. It's like fighting the world and losing, but winning at the same time." Her face pressed into the dust, the mud biting at the skin beneath her cheek, and for a moment she believed she could be finished. But not yet. Not while there was breath to spare and a life to bring into the world. Then the birth came upon them, with the stealth of a storm that refuses to announce itself until first the sky sings. The trench filled with a different kind of sound, the soft, urgent sob of life entering the world, the sudden raw cry that pierced the air as if the baby's voice themselves demanded to be heard. The first breath crowed through the musk of smoke and damp earth, a little creature discovering warmth and sound in a world that had learned to fear the night. "Shh! There you go," the nurse crooned, encouraging, as if coaxing a stubborn note from a violin. "Breathe for Mama. Breathe for all of us." Araminta's hands moved, one finding the child's head, the other framing the little body with care that transcended fear. The mud on her gloves smeared the child's skin in dark, sooty lines, and a shard of light crept into the trench, illuminating the nurse's gloved hands as they worked with practiced precision. The baby's cry grew steadier, stronger, and the world seemed to tilt again, this time toward something wonderfully new. The moment was not silent, nor did it pretend to be. The regiment's men, rough, stubborn, battle-worn, held their breaths, eyes fixed on the miracle that had just entered the world in the mud and cold of a trench that had never been meant to witness birth. A hush fell, interrupted only by the huff of a far-off gust, the faint creak of wood, and the newborn's rattle of breath, each sound stitching itself into the hard fabric of war. "Captain Beck," a voice ventured, careful and baffled, "do we declare this? Do we tell the world?" It was the same voice that had asked not long before whether Vale could endure, whether the regiment could continue to pretend not to notice. The question hung in the air, pressing down on the trench like a wet blanket. Beck answered with a quiet gravity that surprised even Araminta, who had learned to expect grimness from his gaze. "We tell no one anything they don't already know," he said, his tone both firm and tender, the way a man might speak to a horse that has learned to trust him with its life. "We tell them only what we must to keep the field." The baby's mother lifted her head, the effort a bright line of pain through the exhaustion. Her voice when she spoke was a whisper, but she spoke with the confidence of someone who has learned to decide a life's course in a single moment. "Her name will be Iris," she said, eyes wet with the gleam of the trench's pale light, a stubborn certainty in her words that refused to be broken by smoke or fear. "Iris Vale." The nurse smiled, not with pride, but with the gravity of a vow kept, to bring a child into a world of war and keep her alive within it. "Iris Vale," she repeated, tasting the syllables as if they were a blessing. Her first breath here in this trench, among men who wore fear as a mark of honor. That is a kind of fire the world will not forget. Around them, the men exhaled, as if they themselves had parted a heavy load. The sound of breaking shells faded. The lines of the battle drew back like a curtain lowering on a stage that had demanded every creature's courage. The air smelled of damp wool and blood and something sweeter, new life stubborn as a seed in winter, stubborn as a memory that refuses to forget. Araminta watched the baby alone for a long moment, the newborn's tiny fingers curling against the nurse's glove, catching the glint of light as if they already knew to seek the truth of this world. She felt a warmth bloom beneath the haze of pain, an uncharted heat, the ache that would become a story she could tell only in the breaths between battles. When the staff finally settled Iris into a blanket, with a careful gentleness that surprised even the nurse, the regiment gathered in a circle along the trench's edge. not loud and shouting as when the battle's chorus began, but hushed, as if speaking would wake the child and thus wake the war anew. The air was cooler now, but the ground between their boots hummed with the memory of what had happened there. The 7 months of secrecy had not ended with the birth, of course. The very fact of Iris's existence made a secret no longer possible to keep in the way they had kept it before. Yet the regiment would not betray its own, not at this moment, not while the life of a child had just begun within a place designed for the taking of life. They would keep Iris's origin within the tight circumference of their own trust, a tightness that existed because they had all learned to trust something larger than the orders that screamed through the channels of command, their own humanity. Days that followed were a ballet of cautious steps and quiet looks. The regiment did not speak of Iris with its voice, but the infant's cry carved a new shape into the coat of their world, a shape that would not be dismissed by the enemy's line or the weather's capricious mercy. The soldiers kept their rituals of care and protection, watching over Vale and Iris as if the child's life depended on every moment they could give, which it did in a way they would not admit aloud. And yet, within the heart of the mother who bore Iris, the old questions did not stay silent forever. What would happen when the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, began to demand more than the regiment could bear? What would be left of their comradeship if the truth came to light? The child Iris was now both a miracle and a possible flame, a spark that could ignite a fire in the camp's sheltered corners. One night, long after Iris's first breath had stirred the trench's quiet, Araminta stood with the nurse at the trench's mouth, the cold air rushing in like a tide against their faces. The stars hung above, pale and distant, indifferent witnesses to the war below. Vale spoke in a voice that was barely more than a breath. "If they ask, we tell them what they need to know. We tell them Iris was born in the field, and that she did not come with a flag, but with a name and a future that may be worth saving." The nurse looked at her, a question in the line of her mouth. "And what about you, Araminta? What will you tell your child about this life you carved for her? What will you tell Iris when she grows old enough to ask why the world asked so much of her mother, and so little of the world's war?" Araminta's gaze drifted to the night, to the glimmer of the river that lay beyond the trench's walls, where the water carried the memory of every night battle and every morning's blood. "I'll tell her," she said softly, the words forming a vow as she spoke them aloud for the first time in 7 months and more. That she was born into a battle and into a promise. That her father and mother fought to keep a life safe, and that sometimes you must bend the truth to keep a life breathing. Iris will know that truth, and she will know we did it for her, for the future we believed could still be carved from the mud and the starless sky. The nurse nodded once, a gesture of acceptance and grim gratitude. "Then we will keep to our course, Vale. We will guard the secret as tightly as if it were a map to a treasure that can never be spent and never be spent away." The days after remained a quiet, heavy drumbeat of routine and whispered care. Iris grew, if only inside the world that Vale carried upon her skin, the sensation of the child's every move, a reminder that life is the most stubborn of rebellions, the only thing worth a regiment's fear and sacrifice. Time, however, is a wily thing in war. It turns a 7-month secret into a question that will not stay silent forever. It is not a betrayal the regiment wants. It is the practical impossibility of still keeping such a secret when the world outside wants to know who they are, what they fight for, and whether a woman who bears a child in a trench can still be counted among them as a soldier. One morning, after a night of rain that turned the trench to a slick trap, the world outside rumbled with a force that reached down to the marrow. The captain called for all hands. They stood in a circle at the trench's lip, the air cold and clean after rain, the earth shining slick and reflective as metal in the early light. Iris lay sleeping on a blanket near Araminta, a pink-cheeked infant with the quiet, irregular rhythm of a small creature who knows nothing of the world's daily hunger. "Vale," Captain Beck said, his tone calm but carrying a note of gravity. "The men are asking questions. The men always are. They want to know who we are. They want to know what we carry into this fight that makes us stronger than fear. We cannot pretend forever that the world does not see what it suspects to be true." Araminta's eyes did not leave Iris, who breathed in slow, even breaths, her tiny hands curling and unclenching with a newborn's instinct. She spoke to the captain as if addressing a fellow soldier instead of a man who wore the burden of leadership. "We protect her," she said. "We protect Iris, that is what we do. That is what we are." The captain inclined his head, a rare gesture that showed respect more than obedience. "That is what we do for each other," he acknowledged. "But the world's eye grows heavier with every battle won and every secret kept." He paused, his gaze sweeping the trench and the men within it, the faces streaked with dirt and fatigue, the eyes hollow with 1,000 injuries the war had carved into their bodies. "The army cannot shelter this forever. The question is not whether to tell, but when and how to tell, and whether we are prepared to shoulder the consequences if we do." The room, the trench's long, curved interior, seemed to shrink as if it were listening to this exchange. The low rustle of the men's breathing and the distant, steady drip of rain still echoing in the ear. Araminta rose slow and careful, every movement a careful negotiation with her body's stubborn truth. She spoke with a quiet gravity that did not deny the fear, but turned its edge toward courage. "When the time comes to tell, we tell not as a confession, but as a claim, Iris. The life that proves our humanity has not yet died in this war." That afternoon, a small event occurred that would, in a week, become a rumor that stretched from their line to the far militia camps beyond the river. A wounded boy, barely more than a man, was brought to the trench, one who had served as a picket with the other side's soldiers near the riverbank. It was not uncommon for such exchange to happen under the veil of night, but what happened during that exchange could not be hidden once the boy opened his mouth. "Who's your captain?" the boy asked, his lips cracked and pale, the stubble of a week-old beard scraping against his cheek as he tried to sit up with the help of a medic. Captain Beck stood over him, his voice steady and slow, grimed with the grime of battle and the heat of a day spent fighting. "I am Captain Elias Beck." The boy's eyes widened, the fear inside him giving way to something closer to awe. "Your regiment," he rasped. "They're not like the ones I've faced. They do not hide things as we do." The veterans around Beckon's eyes flickered toward each other, an unspoken exchange, a decision made in the space between heartbeats. It might have been fear. It might have something more like solidarity. A vow that whatever lay in the spaces between enemies would not be betrayed by fear. Beck's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. "We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves," he said, and there was a careful, deliberate emphasis on the word fight, as if to remind the boy that the fight was not merely for land or honor, but for life itself. "We don't surrender to the truth. We shoulder it." The boy coughed, a wet, rattling sound that cut through the air, and then nodded, a gesture of respect that did not quite fit his youth. The exchange ended with the medic's steady hands moving to help the boy fall asleep again, the night drawing closer around them like a heavy shawl. Whether the exchange leaked into the world beyond their trench, Araminta could not know for certain. It felt to her like a thread pulled tight across a field, a line drawn and then erased by the wind, only to reappear in the next dawn's light in a different shape. What did become clear on that day, though, was that the secret could no longer remain as isolated as it had been. It would need public recognition or a new lie, both dangerous, both heavy with consequences. The regiment's decision then, the one they would cling to with the stubbornness that had kept them, month after month upright in the mud, was simple in its fearsome resolution. Iris would be kept shielded, the truth whispered only in the tight circle of comrades who would not betray the life they had fought so hard to preserve. They would endure as soldiers do, with the weight of a story that would not be broken if they could hold it together, if they could keep the world at bay long enough to finish what they had started, and so they pressed on. The final days before Iris's birth in the trench were a different kind of storm. The pressure on the unit grew heavier, not from the shells and gunfire, but from the questions that burrowed into the men's minds as they watched a child's cry become part of their daily life. Some whispered about the enemy's spy, about infiltrators who might learn the truth and use it to break the regiment. Others whispered about what the world would do to a pregnancy born among soldiers in the field, an image that would sicken even the strongest of men. Vale listened to these voices with a sense of duty she scarcely understood. She did not fear the consequences as much as she feared the moment when Iris would become a symbol the world could not ignore. Yet she found strength in the child's heartbeat, a constant rhythm that kept time with her own breath, and with the drumbeat of every march that had carried them through the long, impossible days. On the day Iris finally came into the world, The trench's world tilted on its moorings, as if the earth itself decided to acknowledge the miracle they stood upon. The moment did not announce itself with the dramatic flair of a grand parade. It began with a low, stubborn ache in Vale's abdomen, and the same quiet acceptance she had learned to summon in the most violent moments of the field. The nurse, her hands always sure, murmured instructions, in a voice that remained level, even as the trench rattled with gunfire and the rain drummed on the wooden planks above. "Breathe," she whispered, "just breathe. I'm here. So is the entire regiment in some way, Vale, even if no one can name them all." Araminta's voice fractured into a breath that was half a prayer, half a vow. "Please," she begged, not to receive mercy from the world, but to give life the chance to exist in the world it would soon touch. "Please, Iris, come to us now." The world, which had spared no mercy for the soldiers on the line, paused for a moment at the quiet of that birth. The baby's cry rose, a clear, bright sound that stung the eye with tears and filled the trench with a new, stubborn melody. The first breath of Iris Vale filled the air with something that sounded almost like hope, something that demanded a memory. When Iris's cry faded to a modest, even pace, the nurse and Araminta looked at each other, with the kind of mutual relief that only a mother and a caregiver can know in the quiet aftermath of a storm. The baby was small and pale but strong, and the little fists that opened and closed with the stubborn will of a creature newly alive told a story all their own. Iris had arrived, not with a flag or a bell, but with a heartbeat and a name, and that was enough to tilt a battlefield toward a future they could not yet predict, but would not surrender to. The regiment's men stood around the nurse's improvised table, the trench's floor damp yet somehow sacred in the light of new life. They spoke in low voices, their words clipped and careful, as if every syllable could wake the old sleep of fear that had never truly left them. Yet the words held a different weight now, a lighter gravity, a sense that birth was not merely a personal victory, but a signal that life, in any form, offered a possibility of something beyond the war's hunger. "They'll ask," one of the older soldiers murmured, the line of his jaw stiff with the old discipline, "What are we? What have we done here?" Vale's eyes met his with a fierce, unspoken rebuke that was also a plea for understanding. "We did what we had to do to survive, to protect a child who had no choice in the war," she said, and in her voice was the quiet, stubborn certainty of a promise kept. "We did not choose this, but we chose to endure it with the life we brought forth." She looked down at Iris, who lay sleeping on the nurse's lap, her tiny form a beacon of life in a world bent toward destruction. The days that followed were a slow, inexorable walk toward whatever the truth would demand next. The regiment did not celebrate their own miracle with braggadocio, or the loud, empty songs that often accompany births in more peaceful times. Instead, they carried Iris with a new urgency, as if the child's breathing could coax a future out of the mud and the smoke. In the quiet hours, Araminta would often slip away from the rest to hold Iris close, feeling the warm weight of life against her chest, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of the baby's breathing. The world outside the trench still rumbled with threat, and yet within the circle of the regiment, a different rhythm played, the rhythm of a life that would test the strength of every lie the unit had spoken, every oath it had kept. And so, the birth in the trench became not a singular event, but a turning point, the moment when a life born from the field, in the shadow of war, asked 1,000 questions of those who held it and offered a singular, unwavering answer. The life itself is worth the risk, worth the deception, worth everything, because to protect a child is to preserve the future they will inherit. Araminta Vale stood one last time at the trench's lip, as the light of day drifted through the smoke, watching Iris's small chest rise and fall in soft, even breaths. The world above them continued to crash and roar, the shouts of soldiers and officers echoing across the field like a chorus of drums. Yet here in this moment, the air felt lighter, less cruel, more like a held breath about to be released into the long, uncertain horizon that awaited them. She spoke softly into the air, a vow spoken aloud at last, not to the world, but to the life she bore and the life she had given into this world's furnace. "I will guard you," she whispered, "and I will teach you to be brave not because you are a child of war, but because you are Iris Vale, and you were born to remind us that life remains possible, even when the world forgets how to dream." The nurse looked at her with a knowing smile, a small radiance in the corners of her eyes that suggested something like pride, rather than pride's bright temptation. "Then we will keep you safe," the nurse replied, the words heavy with truth and faith. "We will guard Iris as if she were a light placed in a very dark room. And we will do what we must to ensure she grows beyond the trenches and into the world that waits beyond the smoke." Araminta's lips curved into a tired but genuine smile. "The world beyond the trench," she repeated, tasting the words as if they were a new flavor on the tongue. "That is where Iris will live." And in that moment a small, stubborn truth settled itself into the heart of the regiment, a truth that could not be denuded by fear or rumor. Iris was not a symbol of scandal or weakness, but a testament to endurance, to the belief that life can push through even the deepest mud, even the most stubborn walls. The regiment would guard that life, would bend the very course of their own fate to shelter it, and in doing so, perhaps, they would save a future in which the war could be remembered not as a story of only destruction, but as a story of life that had found a way to begin again, even in a trench. The story of Iris Vale, told in the quiet breaths, the careful glances, the soft commands and the heavy tremor of the earth when shells fell, became a living thing in the unit's memory. It did not erase the war's cruelty or the pain of the long months of secrecy, but it did carve out a moment of mercy, a pause in the flood of numbers and losses, a reason to keep going when the world seemed determined to forget the humanity that stood on the line. And so the narrative held, unspoken and steadfast, through the days that followed, through the nights that stretched toward dawn, through the mud and the blood and the rain. Iris slept in her mother's arms or on a nurse's lap, a small glow in the dark, a bright ember that would, in due time, become a promise of tomorrow. Araminta Vale stood once more at the trench lip, the sun pale on the horizon, the air cooler, the sound of distant drums now a steady heartbeat behind the veil of morning light. Iris stirred in her arms, a soft, contented sigh escaping the infant's lips as she settled deeper into sleep. Vale spoke softly, the words a quiet benediction. "We did not surrender," she said, looking out toward the field where the flags would someday be raised again, where the memory of a girl who carried a life within her would become a legend that the men would tell to their children and their grandchildren, not to lift their hearts with sorrow, but to remind them that the world can still birth new life in time of terror. The regiment did not respond with boisterous cheers or dramatic declarations. They simply stood, their bodies taut with the wounds of war, their breath kept in check, like a held breath before the plunge of a deep, uncharted stream. Yet in that stillness lay an answer to the question that had haunted them all. What value does a life have when the world is at war? The answer in their shared stubborn silence was irrefutable. Life has value enough to endure, to protect, to birth, to fight for, to carry forward into the next dawn. Iris Vale, born in a trench, would learn the truth of that value one day, to the rhythm of a heart that began its own story in the cold, stubborn field that had witnessed both war and mercy in a place no map would claim. And so, as the light grew brighter and the world resumed its grinding, inexorable march toward an ending no one could predict, the regiment moved with a renewed quiet purpose, their secret secure within the quiet corners of their loyalty. Iris cradled against a future they would fight to preserve, and Araminta Vale, who had carried a life within her and become its fiercest guardian,